Now let's get into the topic of French wine and terroir. What does terroir mean? Well, although grapes can grow almost everywhere in the subarctic northern hemisphere, no single variety can grow everywhere. And each variety can only flourish in some particular place or special subset of places, each with its own very particular soil, climate, and terrain. Over thousands of years, wine growers have experimented with grapes and techniques to determine the maximally efficient grape variety suitable to each of these different terroirs. Terroir is thus the term that covers the grape varieties, terrain, soil, climate, and tradition-based production techniques in a legally circumscribed area of French earth. So we should be careful not to synonymize terroir too much with land. Um, it really does have to do with the production techniques as well, or the human element. Roger Dion said, "The role of the soil in the development of a Grand Cru scarcely exceeds that of the material in the creation of a work of art." For example, Pinot Noir grapes cannot be grown in Provence because the climate there is too warm. The grape would ripen too quickly in the heat of summer, and the flavor of the grape would not correctly develop. Pinot Noir is grown in Burgundy, where it is much cooler and the grapes can be harvested much later in the season, giving the fine-skinned, delicate grapes time to express the full complexity of their flavor. Heat is not the only factor, however. In Santorini, for example, grapes are trained into basket shapes close to the ground because if they were allowed to form high bushes, the strong winds that rush over the Greek Isle in the spring would decimate the vines. In Algeria, for another example, which has a more desert climate, the vineyard floor is piled high with stones to keep the roots cool and lessen water evaporation. These examples are all features of terroir, which is more than just the soil contents and climate. It is also the human expertise that interacts with the natural element, developing or degenerating alongside it. It is the terroir of a wine that gives it its particular properties and aesthetic value. George Gall explains it thus: "The dimensions which comprise a terroir have values that have evolved over centuries of experiment and selection. There is a set of principles and a philosophy, hence a theory, which underlies the concept of any given terroir, and it is precisely this theory which is invoked when one judges, 'This is a Burgundy.'" To use a different approach, the winemaker Randall Graham, whom we have to thank for the introduction of screw caps on premium wines, likened the experience of terroir with the Taoist practice of qigong, or the successful movement of qi, which is the life force that is shared between all animate and inanimate beings. He said that before going to a particularly memorable wine tasting, he had attended a Qigong class during which he was asked to stand very still and become attentive to the qi of the trees that were all around him, to absorb their qualities by breathing them in not just through his lungs, but with all his attention. The idea was that if he slowed down enough and opened his attention, many different orders of beings, animals, trees, and even stones, could speak to him if he allowed himself to listen. This experience of opening himself to communication with qi, he likened to his capability to experience terroir when later tasting wine. The perception of terroir thus requires, according to Graham, the ability to perceive a very refined and delicate type of speech. If the terroir can be discovered by the drinker, then the soul of the wine may be revealed. Graham pondered whether the French produce superior wine because they are better able to renounce their egos, subordinating themselves in pursuit of the wine's voice. Graham considered the French to have a more spiritual approach to wine production compared to their American counterparts. So, the essence of a particular terroir cannot be measured, but it can be located and savored. And in this, as the wine critic Matt Kramer noted, puts terroir at odds with science, which demands proof by replication rather than in dazzling uniqueness. Given the scientific calibration of the modern mind, which demands measurable data to reliably weigh before it expends resources, understanding terroir then might require us to fundamentally alter our way of thinking and conceiving the world. It is a hearkening back. The French historian Marc Bloch provides a window into this past in his great work on the medieval world entitled Feudal Society in the following lines. The men of the two feudal ages were close to nature, much closer than we are. And nature as they knew it was much less tamed and softened than as we see it today. People continued to pick wild fruit and to gather honey as in the first ages of mankind. In the construction of implements and tools, wood played a predominant part. The nights, owing to wretched lighting, were darker. The cold, even in the living quarters of the castles, was more intense. In short, behind all social life, there was a background of the primitive, of submission to uncontrollable forces, of unrelieved physical constraints. As a woman, I think of childbirth as well during this time, where the possibility of mother and child surviving hovered around 50%. I wonder how many women would choose nowadays to become pregnant given such a reality. One's expectations were radically different during this time. I wonder whether our modern world, with all its sanitary and efficient conditions, to which we owe nearly doubled lifespan, make us more attached to ourselves and thus less likely to engage with the more mystical aspects of terroir. But to be fair to us, it's not like Madame de Rambouillet was out there pruning the vines at her castle or whipping up new bottling techniques. All over Western Europe, but especially in France, the wine-growing tradition flourished not under the guidance of particular families, but rather at the monasteries. The Benedictine and Cistercian orders in particular dedicated themselves to the articulation of God's land and devoted themselves to the cultivation and propagation of its fruits. This way of life provided the hard labor prized in these orders for the salvation of the soul, as well as a means to earn money and reputation for the monasteries themselves. Indeed, it was the Benedictine monk Dom Pierre Perignon who invented vin mousseux, or foamed wine as it was called at the time, or what we now know as champagne. It was perfect timing. The stars were definitely aligned. Both Dom Perignon and the luxury monarch par excellence, Louis XIV, were both born in 1638 and died in 1715. The effervescence of Champagne was the perfect complement to the Sun King's building projects that focused everything around the idea of light and reflection. The bubbles of the champagne glass were just another layer of mirrors glinting back into the king's eyes, the dense center of splendor that he had gathered to himself as so many symbols of French supremacy. And of course, if you could make it at Versailles, you could make it anywhere. Champagne quickly became wildly popular all over Europe and especially England. And by the mid-18th century, places as far away as India were placing large orders of champagne. Even by 1690, champagne was included in the dictionary entry for the term régaler, or to treat someone to a perfect meal. As the example went, if you really wanted to régaler your friends, which, remember, was not only a nice thing to do, but a measure of your identity as an honnête homme this time, you absolutely needed to serve champagne. I think it's still true today. As an aside, and I'm sure most of you know this already, but only those sparkling wines produced in the Champagne region of France may correctly be called champagne. All other sparkling varieties, due to their different terroirs, should be designated according to their specific regional denominations. Prosecco, for example, comes from a number of Italian provinces, while cava comes from Spain. These distinctions are important, especially for the French. For example, Spanish sparkling wine was often referred to in Spain as champagne, but they were legally required to desist using this term in order to abide by European Union standards, which were set to protect products of specific designated areas. As another example, Roquefort cheese designates only those cheeses made from the milk of a specific breed of sheep and matured in the natural caves around the town of Roquefort-sur-Souzon in the Aveyron region of France, where it is then colonized by the fungus Penicillium roqueforti that grows in these caves. Not to complain, but it does bear mentioning that on the other side of the Atlantic, Philadelphia cream cheese was invented and still produced in upstate New York. Philadelphia was thrown on the label because in the 19th century, the Philly area was known for its dairy production, and the creators of cream cheese wanted to blur the public imagination a bit in favor of its bottom line. Old world versus new world.